That was the only.
Oh.
Did you get that message? Oh, you're recording. I grew up Presbyterian. I became Catholic when I married my ex, and then found St. James, the Episcopal Church, in 2013, I think. Yeah. So, and my professional self has been scattered and varied as well, because I was a nurse first at 20, and then got married and had 4 children. I was very, very fortunate to be able to stay home with them until divorce. And then I went back to work, but I went back to work as a psych nurse, got really interested in that part of the world. And so I got my bachelor's in social work when I was 49, and my master's at 50. So I'm a late bloomer in that respect. So I'm also therapist. And interestingly, well, that's another story. But I really love Community of Hope. It's my favorite of all the things that I do. And I'm also in the School for Spiritual Direction in Bryan, Texas. Find, F-I-N-D, if any of you are interested. It's a great program, 3 years worth of great stuff. Anyway, that's me, pretty much. Grandchildren abound, and I'm grateful. So, I'm supposed to be talking about listening. Today, and Benedict says in his very first sentence, listen carefully, my child, to my instructions, and attend to them with the ear of your heart. But what does that mean? In your manual, Joan Chittister helps us by saying, Benedict, spirituality is about listening to 4 realities: the Gospels, the rule, one another, and the world around us. Most of us listen easily to 1 or 2 of these realities, but only with difficulty do we listen to all 4. So we're supposed to be reading the rule on a daily basis right now, anyway, and I do. My rule looks like this, because I've read it, I don't know. Well, I've been a Community of Hope person for like 4 years, 5 years. So I've read this through all those years, and found all those things that mean one thing or another to me at the time, different times. So we're supposed to be reading the rule daily. And then last week you got some information about the theology of pastoral care. So I think we all have different ways of listening to the Gospels. So I want to focus on listening to one another this week. It's often called compassionate listening. Compassionate listening conveys love, caring, acceptance of others as they are, non-judgmental acceptance, which is, I think, a difference. Acceptance of others with still thoughts in your mind about a person's situation or their status or their, whatever. That's not, to me, that's not non-judgmental. And then honoring that individuality. Listening goes deeper than hearing. And so Joan also says it takes a lot of listening to hear the needs of those around us before they even speak them. But there's no good human community without it. Listening and love are clearly a piece. Have you ever noticed when you're listening to someone that you're actually figuring out in your mind, what will I say next? Let's see, what story can I tell that's similar? Oh, so, that's happened to me. Yeah, I can, that's not the kind of listening we're talking about. But that's exactly what my struggle is. Being a retired therapist, an old nurse, mother, and social worker, I am very used to trying to come up with good advice or soothing words to make things better. I've been having to work really hard to tune in my listening and not my speaking. At not doing those things when I'm with a pastoral care receiver. Yeah, or even my children. My daughter often tells me that, Mom, she says, you're minimizing her feelings, therefore not listening, and she feels angry and disregarded. I have to recognize this. I have to be aware of that, even though my intention is to help her feel better, right? She's also a mother, a social worker, a therapist, and now she's in her second year at the seminary Southwest. So she and I are getting better at helping each other communicate. So, but how do we do that? We must put ourselves aside, all that's going on in our own lives, our own worries and our own concerns, and really be there with this other person. Be in the moment. For me, before I go in to see someone, I say a silent prayer that helps me focus on the other person. Helps me know when to say something and when to shut up. I struggle with that. And to be able to get out of the way of the work of the Holy Spirit. So many times when I look back, I've not been able to step back and let God or the Holy Spirit do his work, thinking that I have to come up with the right words or the right response, etc. There are many things to keep in mind when visiting a person, trying to listen and trying to communicate that you're really there for them. One is body language. We need to convey the impression that we're really listening and care. We're not just showing up, but we really care. We're glad to be there. Things like sitting close, but not too close, facing the person, leaning slightly forward, making eye contact, nodding your head are all helpful. And be aware of your facial expression. We convey very caring attitudes just by our facial response. You might try practicing in front of the mirror, your facial expressions like, oh, and see what you see. See what you see. See how it might feel, how it feels inside, and see how it might feel looking at yourself from a receiver's point of view. And try not to sit there with no expression. Like that just doesn't communicate caring whatsoever. my opinion. Some things to avoid are squirming in our seat, foot tapping, looking around the room or at the clock or your watch. Those things say you don't want to be there and you don't have time for them. Above all, don't interrupt when a person is talking. Let them finish their thought or their sentence. Here's a big one. Don't be afraid of silence. Sitting in silence with a person can be also very comforting. So many of us, me included, get very uncomfortable with short periods of silence. I always felt like I should be saying something, especially something important at those times when nobody else is speaking, to fill in the gaps. But remember to let God do the talking. A simple touch on the shoulder or the hand or holding a person's hand can have deep value in letting the person know you're there for him. But touch is tricky, really tricky, especially now in COVID times and when the world seems to have a fear of everything. So I'm a very touchy person. I love to hug and touch, but I have to evaluate each situation very carefully before I act on that. It's okay too to ask, may I hold your hand? If everything else seems comfortable. As I was studying this subject, I found that there are many different types of listening, depending on who is suggesting them or what they're suggested for, like interviewing or team projects or a lot of work situations where listening is important. Some places they said there are 7 types, some said 8, one even said 10. So you don't have to remember these or write them down or anything. You can look them up too if you want to, but just to give you an idea, there's comprehensive listening, discriminative listening, critical listening, full listening, deep listening, therapeutic listening, empathetic listening, which is what we do a lot of. Selective listening, which is only paying attention to part of what a person is saying or what you think you want to hear. Partial listening is being distracted by other things, either in your mind or physically, and not hearing the whole message. And false listening, actually sitting there pretending to be listening and not listening at all. So, and then there's holy listening, and it's not just us listening, it's the Holy Spirit. But as lay chaplains, we focus on the ones that bring us closer to our receiver, help them feel comfortable to share with us. And we want to leave them with a sense of not only being heard, but a feeling of support and love, maybe even closer to God. Active listening is where we paraphrase what we hear back to them in different words, usually used by therapists to be sure they have the correct content, but helpful for lay chaplains too. Communication with open-ended questions instead of questions that can be answered with yes or no. Like instead of, did you have lunch today? You might say, what did you have for lunch today? I couldn't think of any other examples of open-ended questions versus yes and no questions. I meant to tell you at the start that if you have any questions, just, unmute and speak up. I'm open to interruptions. It's great. So can you think of other examples of open-ended versus yes and no questions? June, go ahead.
If you're visiting somebody, you could say something like, well, how's your week been? Or what have you done since I saw you last? Or, sometimes I think you bounce it off of things they say sometimes. Oh, well, my children came to visit. Oh, well,
Tell
try to
me
think of.
about, tell me about that.
Yeah, tell me, oh, how did that go? Did you enjoy seeing? Yeah, but that's a yes question, yes or no. But yeah, you could bounce it off of that.
It's tricky sometimes and you can catch yourself, but yes, follow your receiver's lead. Wherever they decide to go, that's where you go. It's true. So here's another a little example of listening. Let me see. Active listening. So your person says, I hate my spouse when he yells at me. He makes me feel like a child. Active listening response might involve something like, so you feel like your spouse doesn't think highly of you or treat you like an equal partner? Sort of look into the feelings behind the words. There's empathetic listening too. Using these types of listening, you can try to understand someone else's point of view as they're speaking, or you can also try to imagine yourself in that person's shoes and what might be going on with them. So what are we listening to? Well, we're listening to a person's speech, paying attention to phrases that might indicate conflict or sadness or struggle or grief. We're listening to a person's thinking, paying attention to important questions, maybe about the future. Some people really get worried about what's going to happen next to them or to the world. I don't know. We're all kind of in that spot. Concerns about family, home, job, or maybe anticipating test results or a report about their treatment. Listen to a person's tone of voice, pitch and speed. A depressed person will only often speak in one tone or maybe very softly, very quietly, while an anxious person may talk rapidly, jumping from one subject to another quickly. Listen to a person's silences. It sounds like crazy to say, well, how can a silence be heard? But there are many kinds of silence, and each should be treated with respect. For example, the silence of reflection, just sitting there thinking about what's going on, maybe. The silence of wanting to be left alone. The silence of trying to hold back or not show emotion. If you can tell that that a person is wanting to show emotion, but really choking back the tears, or you can encourage them to allow that to happen. It's okay. Help them feel comfortable in your presence. The old phrase, silence is golden, contains a great deal of truth. As listeners, we should sit comfortably with each other. Oh, no, yes, but also with each and every silence, reflecting on what's happening for this person, and resist the urge to rush in with words. Again, try to step back and not get in the way of the Holy Spirit. Listen to a person's feelings. These might be expressed in words, or tears, or laughter, in silence, or in a person's body language. You know, if they're all hunkered, down and curled up, they might be feeling depressed or sad. It's always nice to go visit someone who's having a great day, and you can see the joy or the laughter in them. So, do you have a pencil and paper? Or ordinarily in person, we would break up into two-person small groups and listen to each other and come back and talk about it. But I want you to just write down some situations and write down what you might be feeling or sensing, or how you might respond. I also have, while you're getting pencil and paper, I also have several handouts that I'm going to send you in an email right after class. You can print them out if you want to stick them in your binder, or not, whatever is meaningful for you. Waiting. I want you to also think of questions that you have for me, because I'm not taking up the whole hour, which usually I don't mind at all, because that just means I don't have to listen till my ears fall off. So, hoping that's true for you too. All right, here's the first one. So you're visiting someone in the hospital who recently had surgery. As you walk in, introduce yourself. You always do that. And say, may I sit down? It's good to ask permission to sit. Don't ever, if you're in the hospital, don't ever sit on the bed. That's a no-no. So you're sitting there close, but not too close, right? And the person says, I don't feel like talking. Nobody around here knows what they're doing. The doctor won't tell me anything. So write down on your paper some of the things you might hear in that. I don't feel like talking. Nobody around here knows anything about what they're doing. The doctor won't even tell me anything. Okay, let's just give a few answers to that first one before we go to the second one. What'd y'all come up with? Just unmute and talk. But not all at once.
So I might say, I might relate that to a time when I felt helpless or not listened to, or relate an experience that I had in the hospital and felt myself in the same situation. So trying to empathize.
Right. Be careful about saying I too much and talking about yourself too much.
Okay,
'Cause it's not about you.
right.
We want to focus on what's going on with them.
Right. So somehow letting them know that you've been through it, that I've been through it, and that I care, and I understand where they're coming from, but it's not about me, it's about them.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Diane, did you have your hand up? Oh. Anybody else? June?
Well, I changed what I wrote down. I started with, you sound very frustrated about the way things are going. And then I decided to back off of that and say, that sounds very frustrating.
Either one of those are just dandy.
Okay.
Dandy. Frustrating is yeah.
So I was trying to think of something to follow that with, what would you follow that with? Do you want to talk more about it? She's just said, I don't want to talk.
Yeah. I would wait after you said, oh, that sounds really frustrating, and see what she says. And if there's a little silence there, it's okay. But she might then just, yes, that's exactly what, and it's just so hard. Hard is always a good word to use. That's really hard to say to them. Maybe anybody else? Maybe you could say something like, you feel like you're not getting the respect that you need, since the doctor doesn't tell you anything, he's not respecting. Several of the examples that I know about say, don't ever say, well, who's your doctor and what does he think he's doing? And I have this doctor that I really love, and you might call him instead. No. But do think about if you're using too many I's. I know what you're saying. Maybe you don't. Don't pretend to know. But say, gosh, that sounds like, frustration. Or if you can't think of anything, that's okay too. You can just, uh, nod your head and be there. Okay, second question. You're visiting someone at home who just lost her husband suddenly. And she says, my life is over. He was all I had. How can God do this to me? What would you say?
Can you ask her to share some of the fun things, some of the good memories?
Right. That would be a good thing to do. It feels like sort of a shift, trying to make her feel better. When we want to first acknowledge what she's feeling. Acknowledge the grief, acknowledge the sadness, and then talk about, oh, well, yeah, what are some of the fun things? Tell me more about him is what I would say.
Can you ask about if they've looked into any grief support groups?
It depends on where they are. You know, if it's if it's real recent, that won't probably work. They're just, you know, right in the middle of the depths of their grief. So making a suggestion like that probably won't fly very well, but if it's been 3 or 4 weeks, 6 weeks maybe, and they're still feeling that way, that might be a good idea. Yeah. What about how can God do this to me? What would you say to that? Well, God just doesn't know what he's thinking. So you can say, sounds like you're really angry with God. It's okay to be angry with God. He's tough, he can take it. Or you're feeling lost without him. In the last module of your manual, it was talking about grief and about helping a person see God's presence in their circumstances. But like I said, when people are hurting in the middle of their deepest grief, they may be more offended than helped by looking for God in the situation. I had a friend 100 years ago whose 4-year-old died of leukemia, their only son. And she was and they'd been through, 2 or 3 years of chemo and hope and despair and hope and going through all that. And she was totally pissed at God and saying, in the Bible it says, ask and you shall receive, knock and the door is open to you. And she said, that's just a bunch of baloney to her at that moment, right? So trying to, it's perfectly fine to be angry with God during those times, and trying to make that better for them is not going to work at that time. Does that make sense? Anything else about that one? So say you're visiting with someone and some family members are there, and they say, well, this is so hard for all of us. What would you say? Because we interact with family when we're there too, not just the visitor the person we're visiting. Think about reflecting back the feeling. This is so hard for all of us. What might you say? Maybe something like, sometimes everything just seems really difficult. Or go ahead. Or did somebody have something to say? No? Diane?
It is hard, and I'm glad you're here for him or for her.
Mm-hmm. And that you have each other?
Right.
Yes. Or tell me about the hardest part. What's the hardest part? Get them to talk about it. We're wanting them to unload some of their difficult feelings. And doesn't mean that you take them on. Just let them go by for you. Because if we take everybody's on, we're not doing ourselves any good. But for them to unload difficult feelings is very helpful. And that's the listening part, listening with the ear of your heart. Say, this really is hard. That's can't get around it. What can I do to help? There's another question you can ask. What can I do to help? You can also, if it seems right, to say, would you like a prayer? And then maybe, what can I pray for you? And they might not know. So then you're on your own about praying. But that's where the Holy Spirit, I think, comes in and gives you some words, whether you know it or not. That's been hard for me because I expect me to come up with the right words. And so I have been really trying hard to put my words in the back of my head and listen for God's or the Holy Spirit's words that might be different. So I challenge you. Here's my challenge to you, and then I'm done. My challenge to you is practice listening. Sounds easy, but really listening with your friends, with your family in the coming weeks. See if you can boost that skill. Make note of it. Write down when it's hard, when you're not sure what other people are saying, when it was confusing for you to listen, or when it seemed impossible to be still and quiet, which is what I have trouble with. Just write those times down. Or when you thought you should say something but didn't know what to say. Gee, I should say something. What should I say? Morton Kelsey, this is in your last module, says the ability to listen is a prerequisite to love. All creative human relationship is based on listening. That's it for me. You have questions?
Can you repeat that last,
I sure can.
please?
The ability to listen is the prerequisite to love. All creative human relationship is based upon listening. And I'm sending, one of the handouts I'm sending you has a whole page of quotes that I like, that you might be helpful, find helpful or not. Other questions?
I'd just like to share something. My husband died 2 years ago accidentally. The circumstances were pretty traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
And my daughter's counselor told her that at best we were functioning at 70% capacity. And we saw that because, I mean, we couldn't even think of words at times. But that's just something to bear in mind if you are dealing with someone who's lost someone.
Yeah, it's a crazy time. Divorce is also a very, very, very crazy time for a lot of people. Yeah. I'm sorry about your husband.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, thank you all for being good listeners. I appreciate it. Take it home, study, practice.
Okay, thank you so much, Tricia. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Um,
Tricia.
I guess listening is something that is a lifelong process. Some of us are better at it than others. I'm probably falling into the group that doesn't listen as much as I should. But it's been a practice over the years if I'm going in to visit
Mhm.
to learn to put my opinions and things. And my best friend is the world's greatest reflective listener. And that is that is a gift that you have to practice and practice and practice to be able to do well. It's like that person in that bed that you're talking about, that was kind of grumbling about everything. And it's easy to feel that way in the hospital. My brother was at that point not too awful long ago. And they finally had somebody come in and talk to him about that. But he felt abandoned.
Mhm.
And quite frequently, I mean, you're laying in that bed for hour after hour after hour. They come in and take your stuff from, and they walk out and they don't ever tell you anything. It irritates me when people take my blood pressure and don't tell me what it is. For instance, if you're going to do tests on me, give me an answer.
It's like, you don't need to know, you're not smart enough to understand what that means. So I don't have to know that.
Yeah,
It's
I think
insulting. It's insulting.
there's a lot of underlying questions when you're talking to people in hospitals.
Mhm.
My doctor didn't tell me anything. Well, your doctor may not know very much at that particular point either, and if you're dealing with a hospitalist and not your doctor, it makes a big difference as well. And it's hard because I think you do sometimes in the hospital feel abandoned. And sometimes if you can figure out what it is that they need that they don't have, it's kind of like, what do you need? That was one of the things that I used to ask when I was going in as a hospital chaplain. Is there anything I can do for you today? And sometimes it's as simple as, I need a warm blanket.
Mhm. Or my water glass is way out of my reach and I can't get it.
Precisely. Mhm. Yeah.
Linda, I know you've had experience with family in the hospital.
Oh, yeah. More than I'd like to even think about.
And some words that you found helpful or not helpful.
Well, my role kind of got redefined because it was my sister, and knowing how she asked trillions of questions. I was just thinking, being one of 5 children and being the oldest, my whole family of origin, what it gave me were these strengths that also contribute to being my weaknesses, which is we would actually debate at the dinner table, So we all were thinking way ahead about, well, how am I going to counter that? Or what's my rebuttal? So I've really had a lot of unlearning to do, if you will. But my role with my sister was slightly different because I knew the kinds of questions that she would ask, and she couldn't speak because she had her voice box removed and she has laryngeal cancer. So sometimes a member of the family has to end up being an ally as well as a compassionate listener. And so sometimes when I saw her struggling, I would say, is this what you need? Nod. I mean, you learn, she had a little tablet that she could write on. that would help us understand what she might need. And that's a whole different experience because I was with someone who could not speak, who made her living speaking. She's an international IT consultant. So you have to get real creative.
Creative. But I was wondering if you heard from other people words that helped or words that didn't help. Just a question.
Well, yes, I did. And one of the things that for her seemed to be helpful was that we're here. We're going to be here.
Mhm.
We can be your voice. And for her, which this was very helpful because this isn't always the case. We tried to reassure her that God was in this situation. God is in every situation and is working in it. And what we have to do is not hold on too tightly, not try to fix or problem solve, but just give the Holy Spirit room to move and to work. And also I was able with her because our mother was a recovering alcoholic. So we went to more AA meetings than we did to church. So mother used to say, these things too shall pass.
Mhm.
And it seems so, I don't know, well, great. Why don't they pass now? It's
Yeah,
just like I have a lot of comebacks after all those years of going to AA meetings. But yeah, just kind of helping her focus. So let's get through this. Let's get through this. She's in radiation and chemo now. So let's get through this day. We can get through this day or this hour. And that seemed to, everybody's so different. And again, I used to excel in problem solving, but I can't do that when I go visit people. That's not the first thing on the agenda. The first thing on the agenda is to be there for them in whatever they're experiencing.
And that's why the listening part is so important, especially with somebody you don't know, to find out who they are and what's important to them.
Yes.
Linda's sister liked the God involved part. Other people may not be happy with that at all. Well, that's not working, I can tell, something like that. But so get to know your person by listening to what's going on.
Well, I like part of what you said about we can be angry at God. I love the Psalms, and that vocalizes a lot of anger and despair and disbelief in the situations we're in. And I was kind of ready for that when my sister Kathy got her diagnosis and such, because I think many people would be angry at God, and God can take it.
Mhm.
But that means we're still in relationship with God if we're angry.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. He's there, by golly, but let me punch him in the face.
Right.
Thanks, Linda. Back to you, Pat.
Okey doke. I was interested in what she was saying because my husband was aphasic for the last year with a brain tumor. And he was a weather forecaster and then a priest. He had talked his whole life, his whole life had been talking, and not being able to talk had to be painful. And yet he latched onto things that are amazing. And it's one of those things that going into a lot of times people will repeat the passages from the Psalms or the Lord's Prayer,
Mhm.
even if they can't say anything else, because it's from a different side of the brain. They'll sing,
Right.
they can sing songs, but because music is on the other side of the brain, it is amazing to me. But going in and just listening to me is still one of the wonderful stories that I have heard. And a lot of times it starts out with, nobody likes me, everybody hates me kind of type of a thing, and it's kind of like, well, what's going on? You can kind of just ask those questions, because sometimes it's just the little things that are niggling them, and they just feel like they're not being heard or not being seen.
Mhm.
And I've been running into that a lot lately, people that just don't feel like they're seen, and COVID has been really bad about that.
Right.
I like that word niggling. I like that.
Anyone else? Some of you have already done some visiting. You could probably tell us a little bit about how you listen in those type of places.
Was really good, Trisha, and from my experience in chaplaincy, it's I think you were also right about like the it's not our job to fix things, and so often when we reach for a fix, it's because what's happening inside of us, and I can feel like I need to defend God or defend the church or defend the doctors or whatever it is, and but I don't. God can handle that, and so often it's giving voice to what it's giving voice to those things actually helps heal them. The expression of them is not a threat, but it can feel that way, especially if you're not used to it. So um, yeah, being grounded in just as I think, was it Friedman that said, be a non-anxious presence in relationship. I think a less anxious presence in relationship is a good thing to strive for, right? We're always going to be a little bit anxious, but um, yeah.
I'm glad you said that about feeling like when you walk in and somebody's really, really angry, feeling like it's a threat towards you. And it's not, it's just them expressing. That's a good thing to remember. Thanks, Jonathan.
I had my brother, my nephew died of Duchenne's when he was 22, and he was diagnosed when he was about 2 years old. And my brother-in-law spent most of his life being angry at God. And because he couldn't understand why God would do that to a little boy.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to understand. We can't.
It is. And you see various different varieties of what happens when children are in that position. And if you've ever walked through a children's ward, it is amazing. Some of them are overcomers, and some of them have just fallen into fear.
Fear is another big deal to listen for.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Diane.
That's something to keep in mind when dealing with people with who've lost children or children with issues. I was watching something the other day, and the person had lost a child, and they said, if you lose your wife, you're a widower, and if you lose your husband, you're a widow, but there's not even a word for losing a child. And I thought, wow, that really, says a lot.
Mm-hmm. I heard that before too. I didn't think about that at all, but my son died 4 years ago, and there's not an ex-mother kind of thing. So, yeah.
For sharing that, Trisha. That's really heavy.
Thank you. Oh, one of the things about my son dying is, well, he's in a better place now, which don't ever say that. However, I feel really good about him being in a better place right now because he wasn't here, you know. This lifetime was difficult for him. So part of his death for me, to be honest, is relief. I thought for sure that I would be like everybody else who lost a child and curl up in the bed in a ball for a month, you know. But no, I wasn't. I was relieved that he's not struggling anymore. So you always have 100 varieties of grief.
And I think, thank you for sharing that, because I think we need to realize that there, you know, we can't have an expectation of what people's grief is, or, you know, how they do it, how long they do it. Everybody is different, and there's no wrong way.
No wrong way.
Mhm.
And I have to tell you another story about somebody who said the right words to me. My son was born with heart disease, so his entire life was not easy, and we never had any promises about how long he would live. So, and he, you know, he went through college and he had 4 great children, and one of them staying with us this weekend. So all that's wonderful. But anyway, so at first I was feeling a little guilty, really guilty about not being in tears all the time when he died, because he died pretty suddenly with his heart. But you know, and feeling a little guilty that I was grateful that he was not struggling anymore. And I actually was on a cruise, and on the last day, which I'm sorry I met this lady on the last day, but I met this lady who was a nurse practitioner, and she worked in pediatric oncology, which got to be a tough spot to be. But anyway, she did a lot of family work with grief and stuff. But so I was telling her, you know, that I know that everybody grieves differently, but I had this little bit of guilt that maybe, you know, I should be sadder or something. But she said, oh no, she said, you've been grieving for 40 years. Said, oh, I didn't even think about that. Little by little, wondering, you know, when he was going to die, or what was going to be, what was going to happen, or so that really helped me. But I'm not suggesting you say that to anybody, but I'm just saying there are words that really do help when you don't expect them to.
Did that help you to let go of that guilt?
Of the guilt, yes. Yes, it really did.
Good.
Now I just miss him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think quite frequently in those type of scenarios, there's a guilt factor in there, especially if it's been a long-term illness of any kind.
I have come to believe that no matter who dies or how they die or the circumstances, thus they're for survivors, whoever they are, daughters. Anyway, there's always some guilt, and it's often not legitimate necessarily. I don't know why we just think, oh, if only I'd done this, or if only, I should have been there. I should have called more often. I should have blah, blah, blah. All those things, I think. And I've told my children, when I die, let go of all that silly guilt, because it'll be there, but it's not worth hanging on to. Anyway.
I keep thinking about the people that we visit quite frequently that have been long-term, they're in their homes. And how do you start conversations with them sometimes?
Good question. Is it you've been visiting them on a regular basis, or this is your first time?
A lot of times sometimes it's that I've been visiting them, but if you're only seeing them once a month, although other people have been seeing them as well, it's sometimes difficult to get a conversation started.
So Pat, quick question. You mean they're homebound?
Homebound, or else they're in a nursing home,
Ah, okay.
where they're fairly isolated.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me on that note, like one thing I've learned and still struggle with, but it's helpful, is to just embrace the awkward. Like starting the conversation is just going to be awkward, like, neither of us know quite what to say, and we're both reaching for words like, can we trust each other? Or we're just both figuring out that sort of space. And so it's just awkward, and that's just okay, and then this is sort of non professional chaplain sanctioned, but sometimes small talk really does grease the wheels, like, talk about the weather for a minute and then pivot, but it can really help sometimes.
I find myself asking, what's new with you? Usually they say nothing. And then it gives me just a few seconds to think some more. Well, how are you feeling? Well, and they might give me my arm still hurts. And then I can say, well, what are your feelings? How are you feeling inside? I don't always get an answer, but it's a question.
I had a elderly lady that I used to visit up in Lubbock who was she had dementia, and it was getting worse and worse. And it was finding something to connect to. And because she didn't like anybody else in the church visiting her. But the dog and I bonded. And I would come in and I would talk to the dog, and I would bring a dog treat for the dog, and her face would light up, and then she'd start talking.
Oh.
And sometimes you got to come in sideways, I think. And part of it is building that relationship with the person. But yeah, the dog and I hit it off before she and I did, but we bonded over the dog.
Sure.
That's not surprising, Kathy. Makes sense. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I also think pastoral care, sorry, I'm talking a lot now, but I also think pastoral care is a little bit like prayer, and which is that, well, it's a lot like prayer. And sometimes when I pray, I feel like we are really connecting, and it's just great. And then a lot of times when I pray, it doesn't feel like that, but I'm still praying, right? And so I learned as a chaplain that uh, you and as a priest, that not every conversation you have is going to feel like just sort of warm and fuzzy, and we're reviewing our life together, and we're talking about grief, and not every conversation is going to be that way, and sometimes you have to talk about the weather for a couple of visits before you get around to the deep stuff. And sorry, there's a plane passing over, but I think that's helpful to just sort of normalize that it's not always going to be the sort of mountaintop experience. Sometimes it is.
I think talking about the everyday sometimes is one of your better introductions. I had a friend of mine that used to visit people in the hospital when we lived in Nebraska. And she had a collection of little flower vases, and she would go and collect flowers from her garden, and she would bring one in because she says, that's a good conversation starter. Isn't this beautiful? See how it smells. You can go a different direction sometimes, and then you go off into stories that they remember, and it's wonderful.
A little bit of show and tell.
Okay, are we ready to close for today, do you think? Okay, our next week we have a friend of mine from my group named Sally Metzger, and Sally is publishing her first book. So she is going to be coming in a little late. It's a children's book. I couldn't think of a better person to be doing the thing on prayer and meditation, because that's very, very much her. She's one of the anomalies. She is not an Episcopalian. She is a Roman Catholic. And her story is a book that was designed for children. And I don't remember what exactly it was about. She read it to us one day, and it was really beautiful. But she's having to have some videography done that same morning, and so she'll get in as soon as she can get here. So she's going to leave us with some questions to probe before, or exercise or something before she gets there. Anyway, let me pray you out, and we will all go on our day. Lord, I give you thanks for Tricia and all that she's taught us and allowed us to think about. I thank you for Jonathan and the idea of being actually embracing the awkward. Quite frequently we are there. I give you thanks for all that we have known and done this past week, as we have already listened with the ears of our hearts quite frequently. Let us go forth into this next part of the week, looking for things to listen to, whether it is the sound of the wind or the voice of a child, person in a bed, a friend at coffee hour, or a new person that we've just met. You've given us an infinite variety of ways to use the ears that you've given us. I thank you for those gifts and rejoice in them. Be with each and every one of us this week. I ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, guys. Okay, we're looking forward to next week. Thank you so much, Tricia. Thank you, everybody. Nice conversations.
Very nice.
Yes.
I'm sorry I was late coming in. I had a lot of trouble with my computer and never did get it to work. So I'm on my phone, which is not ideal for me. But anyway, I will go back and look at the earlier part of the session and catch myself up.
Oh, okay, that's good. I'm turning off the recording as of now.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.